think we may as well kick off. Okay. Yes. Good afternoon, and welcome to the second of these Jane talks on the life of Jane Austen. We see her again, you saw yesterday, sketched by Cassandra on one of those holidays. This is thought to be when the sketch was taken, on one of those holidays that the family took in the West Country after the retirement of the Reverend George Austen, which he decided to do in December 1800, and then moved to Bath, at which news, if you remember, Jane is reputed to have fainted on the kitchen floor, and she only made happy when her father promised to give their family annual trips to the sea. In Persuasion, so there's debate about where Cassandra drew her sister, where Jane was sitting at the time. In Persuasion, Jane Austen mentions a beautiful spot near Weymouth on the south coast, a sweet retired bay backed by dark cliffs, the happiest spot for watching the flow of the tide, for sitting in unwearied contemplation. Now, passionate Austenites dying to know where this actually is, and it seems to have been established to be Charmouth, just above Charmouth Beach, oh Lord, I can't see, to the east of Lyme Regis. Where's Lyme Regis? There's Lyme Regis. So it's somewhere round here. Lyme Bay was a favourite spot. So maybe that's where Jane was sitting. And it was probably produced, this sketch, during a visit in the August of 1804, because George Austen had announced this impending move back in December 1800. It had taken place the following May, and he had kept his promise to his youngest daughter, taking wife and daughters each summer to the Dorset or Devon coast. Very fashionable. By the turn of the 19th century, the seaside holiday, partly for health, partly for entertainment, is replacing the inland watering place or spa. Brighthelmstone, that's Brighton to us, on the south coast, and Scarborough, up in the northeast, are the new Cheltenham and Bath. And it was here in Scarborough, back in the mid-18th century, that a new machine had been invented, making it possible for modest ladies to enter the sea, a bathing machine inside which you get undressed and dressed again. You see them there, a sort of beach hut on wheels it is. From about 1750, sea air, everyone's being bullied to go and swim in the sea. Sea air and sea water are being recommended by doctors for health, and Jane likes getting into the sea. She writes to Cassandra from Lyme in 1804 that the bathing was so delightful and Molly so pressing with me to enjoy myself that I believe I stayed in rather too long. Now, Molly is Jane's bathing woman or dipper, a very important person, necessarily robust, like this famous dipper of the day, Martha Gunn of Brighthelmstone, who was reputed to have dipped in their infancy both Kings George III and George IV, and described by the Morning Herald as being the venerable priestess of the bath. Now, her job, fully dressed, as you see, and generally, though not always, aided by a horse, is to push the bathing machine into the sea, then bully the nervous swimmer down the steps of the bathing machine into the water and then out again, shielded from watchers on the shore by the machine itself. So the dipper must be jolly tough as Martha Gunn would appear to be. Anyway, she lives to be 89 years old. She is a good advertisement for sea, water, and sea air. Now, you can't have too much modesty. Here is another version of the bathing machine. Here you see it is designed by a Quaker glove maker from Ramsgate with a modesty hood for total and utter privacy while bathing. Now, this machine would have been more expensive than the native version, the basic version, and I don't think Jane Austen would have liked it at all, because the hood shuts out the sky. Ghastly. These machines are designed for ladies, because in Jane Austen's day, believe it or not, boys and men bathe in the Buff. There they all are, yes. Mixing the sexes. This mingling of the sexes would, of course, diminish during the increasingly prudish 19th century. And by the year 1860, you will be relieved to hear nude bathing is outlawed even for men. And there is that modesty hood again, very prominent at the back. Okay. 2 seaside images from just 12 years after Jane's death. They're both in Brighthelmstone, Brighton. Up here, ladies are wearing a great Bath hat and very loose garment with loose sleeves to conceal the shape of the body. There's the dipper. There's another dipper who's lifting a lady into the sea. They've got a vast weight to carry, these poor dippers. Look at their own garments as well as the lady they're supposed to be carrying. And on the right, here they are again, these poor dippers, wearing hats more suited to church on Sunday than getting into the sea. By God, the weight is just appalling. Now, with regard to Jane Austen, she says she likes bathing. Now, what does she mean? Does she mean swim? She could do. She was fit. She was a keen walker, walks all over the hills near Bath. Men swam, most famously, just a few years after the Austens' visits, Lord Byron swims the Straits of the Dardanelles or Hellespont, 4.5 kilometres between Europe and Asia. He swam breaststroke, by the way, because the crawl is said not to have reached Europe until later, but nonetheless, we do not know. This one up here looks as if she's attempting a bit of a crawl, and now I'll show you another woman also attempting a bit of a crawl by Thomas Rowlandson's fictional Venus, observed keenly from the cliff top. Gentleman with binoculars. Well, now look, I'm not seriously suggesting that this is anything to do with Jane Austen. We can perhaps picture her somewhat along lines depicted by Diana Spurling, who we met yesterday back in a little pond in her Suffolk home, Dines Hall. 2 bathers here wearing an utterly shapeless garment. One of them is lying on her back, perhaps making use of a stick in case maybe it's her first time in, and the shapeless garment probably goes down to the ankles, do you not think? And the girl on the left has her arms up in a mild version of the scream, does she not? I would imagine this is the sort of costume worn by Jane Austen, however, I do not know. Back in Brighthelmstone now, on a grey, windy, cold day, men and women are bravely descending those steps on their way to the bathing machines, perhaps unwillingly. He's lost his hat, he's going to miss that. Now, the doctors of the day, they're awful. They have an unkind theory that it is beneficial, it's most beneficial to bathe, if you're going to do it at all, in the winter months. So Jane's cousin Eliza from Paris spends December and January heroically in Margate with her little son, bathing in the frost and snow in an effort to improve his health. It doesn't work. Little Hastings de Fayed dies aged 5, and he is buried in a church in Hampstead, very near me, together with his mother, and we still don't know quite whether or not Jane Austen can swim. However, when she looks at the sea or even thinks about it from a safe distance, it is not solely in connection with seaside holidays. The Plum Pudding in Danger by James Gilray, 1805. On the left, British Prime Minister Pitt the Younger is carving up much of the globe, including the profitable West Indies, of which more tomorrow. On the right, poor little Napoleon Bonaparte is in an awful state, cutting off a very small slice of Europe. However, we don't have to feel too sorry for him. The wars with France have by now, 1805, been going on for 12 years, but this carving up has gone on for centuries, officially, unofficially, by land, and even more by sea. Mariners of all sorts from both countries capturing each other's warships and earning a set proportion of the loot from a grateful government. Now, this is how Captain Wentworth in Persuasion has made his fortune. Yes, Anne and Captain Wentworth would be nothing without prize money. And Jane's brothers, Frank and Charles Austen, both live and work in the hope of capturing French ships. They're part of this system. They do well out of it, especially Frank, and we will hear about them in a moment. But let's just have a little opposite example. Here we have the British East Indiaman, the Kent, portrayed on her way to Bengal with a large cargo, but she's never going to get to Bengal because she's being captured. She's portrayed here in the middle of being captured by a small private armed French vessel known as a brig. Small armed ship is a brig. This capture takes place in October 1800, not long before the Austens move to Bath, where they will read all about it in the papers. And this painting, rather nice painting, is by one of the pirates who capture her, under the command of a particularly famous pirate, Robert Surcouf from Brittany, of whom Bretons are proud to this day. There are many statues of him in Saint-Malo. Well, having captured the Kent, the pirates then sell her to the Danes, with whom Britain is about to be at war, and they make a lot of money. The East India Company would lose £29,000, a lot of money even today. All England will have been livid, including Captain Frank Austen, who himself has dealings with the East India Company, though luckily for him, no money in the Kent. Now, just one more word about this artist pirate, Louis Ambroise Garneret. He's an enterprising and talented fellow. Having made money out of the capture of the Kent, he puts the money into a slave ship. He gives himself the job of first lieutenant. He makes more money. He is then captured by the British. He spends 8 years in prison in Portsmouth, where he makes more money out of British merchants selling them lovely paintings like this of captured British ships. And later, under Napoleon, this pirate will become a respected museum director in Rouen and the first official marine painter of the French Navy. Back to the Austens. Now, Captain Frank, 1 year older than Jane, no pirate, but he relies on profit from the capture of enemy ships. Pay in the Navy is often in arrears. You need a backup. Frank has always been very daring, remembers Jane. As a little boy, he was chippy and even insolent, fearless of danger, braving pain, and threatened very oft in vain. In fact, a godsend to the Navy and the Napoleonic Wars, and he does well and he rises quickly. On one occasion, patrolling the coast, what was later the Riviera coast, between Marseille and Genoa in his armed ship, the Petteril here, he manages to capture, it is said, I can't quite believe it, but 40 French ships with officers aboard. and makes £750 prize money, according to his financially minded brother Henry, who must have been very jealous. Another time, while within range himself of the French batteries at Marseille, Captain Frank Austen drives 2 of their warships onto the rocks and captures that one, the Ligurienne, I've gone far too far, captures the Ligurienne without losing a man. Yeah. Now, Frank had left home the Steventon Rectory for the Royal Naval Academy in Portsmouth, aged 12. He'd really wanted to go. 2 years later, he's out to the East Indies as a midshipman volunteer, a sort of apprentice. And from then, for the next 28 years, until the final peace with France, the minds of his family, including his 2 sisters, are at sea with him and with younger brother Charles, who follows a few years later in Frank's footsteps. And here we see the middle deck of a man of war, where the crew sleep and eat, and where much of the boys' lives will be spent, observed in peacetime by the ever-curious, amazing Thomas Rowlandson. Now, life, in spite of those guns on the left, great big guns on the left, yes, this is the gun deck, but we're in peace and life is quite fun. Everyone seems to have a dog there, dog somewhere there. He's got a violin and he's got a girlfriend. There's some intractable problem over here on the left to do with the boy in a blue coat. I can't imagine what it is. Anyway, they spend most of their lives there. Frank writes home regularly, but his letters, most of them haven't survived. A few have, but not many. He might have described scenes like this, and he might have described some battles, as we shall see. In Jane and Cassandra's few surviving letters, we catch them wondering, where are Frank and Charles? Have they received letters, or have the letters gone astray? Are they in line for promotion, which depends, surprise, surprise, on who you know? And their father, the Reverend George, is always having to write pleading letters in favour of his sons to influential friends and possible patrons. When aged 14, after 2 years at the Royal Naval Academy in Portsmouth, 14-year-old Frank leaves as a midshipman for the East Indies. His father writes him another sort of letter, very nice, not for him but to him, with Polonius-style good advice. Frank would keep this letter all his life. When he dies, aged 91, he lives longer than any of the others. It is found among his belongings, much read. Among other things, his father tells him very sensibly to be kind to his inferiors, to write thank you letters, and to brush his teeth. And his 13-year-old sister dedicates a story to him, The Adventures of Mr Harley. Mr Harley was one of many children, destined by his father for the church and his mother for the sea. Desirous of pleasing both, he prevailed upon Sir John, the patron, to obtain for him a chaplaincy on board a man of war. He cut his hair and sailed. In half a year he returned and set off in the stagecoach for Hogsworth Green. His fellow travellers were a man without a hat, another with 2, an old maid and a young wife. This last appeared about 17, with fine dark eyes and an elegant shape. Mr Harley soon found out she was his Emma, and recollected that he had married her a few weeks before he left England. The end. Now, Frank doesn't return to England for another 5 years. He's 19 now. He's a lieutenant. He'd left as a 12-year-old and returned as a young man. Extraordinary for his family. Now, years later, in her 30s, living in Chorlton, his sister brings something of the kind into Mansfield Park, whose shy young heroine, Fanny Price, is thrilled to learn that her midshipman brother, William, is about to come on shore leave after 7 years. Fanny waits impatiently to see him in the hall, in the lobby, on the stairs, waiting for the first sound of the carriage which was to bring her a brother. And when he at last arrives, it was long before she could recover from the agitated happiness of such an hour. It was some time even before her happiness could be said to make her happy, before the disappointment inseparable from the alteration of person had vanished, and she could see in him the same William as before, and talk to him as her heart had been yearning to do through many a year. Young as he was, William had already seen a great deal. He had been in the Mediterranean, in the West Indies, had been taken on shore by the favour of his captain, and this happened to Frank, and in 7 years had known every variety of danger which sea and war together could offer. And though Mrs. Norris could fidget about the room and disturb everybody in quest of 2 needlefuls of thread or a second-hand shirt button in the midst of her nephew's account of a shipwreck or an engagement, everybody else was attentive, and even Lady Bertram, who's very idle, could not hear of such horrors without unmoved or without lifting her eyes from her work to say, "Dear me, how disagreeable. I wonder anybody can ever go to sea." Now, during the family's years in Bath, as I said, here's a bit of a closer view. They holiday as promised near Lyme Bay, which is somewhere up there. And as we see, look, it's quite, I think that's Lyme Bay, and it's quite a way away from Dover and Calais, and from Boulogne-sur-Mer, where Napoleon has constructed an enormous army camp, and with which he plans to invade Britain in just those years in which the Austens are visiting the seaside. Their move to Bath coincided with the brief peace of Amiens between England and France. This doesn't last long. He's making serious invasion plans, financed by the sale of Louisiana to the United States for 50 million French francs. And it is rather interesting to note that the new young United States, freed from colonial oppression, has only been enabled to make this purchase by a loan from a British bank. That's Baring Brothers. So there. He spends the money on constructing 3,000 flat-bottom boats to carry the army across the Channel, on improving roads and ports along the coast, and on the construction of this camp, which is topped with a monumental column inspired by Trajan's column in Rome, topped by a statue of the emperor somewhere facing across the Channel. I think it's probably that. Yes. Now, there are, as usual, very few letters which survive from these years, 1801 to 5. So when, after the brief peace, round about 1803, war starts up again, we don't know to what extent people get the wind up. Later in the 19th century, Thomas Hardy will set his historical novel, The Trumpet Major, in that same part of the coast which he calls, as we know, Wessex. So we'll just briefly have a thought about Hardy while looking at a lovely painting of the area by Turner, who depicts the area just a few years after the Austen summer visits. And surely when Jane Austen writes that landscape must be among the joys of heaven, she might have views like these in mind. It's such a shame she never saw Italy. Now, while writing The Trumpet Major, Hardy draws heavily on accurate historical records of the area, according to which there was fear of invasion, even to the west. And in the years before the decisive sea battle of Trafalgar in October 1805, there was a plan to move the King and Queen to a place as inland as you can possibly get, which is Northamptonshire. The British, they strengthen Dover Castle, they build Martello Towers along the south coast, they dig a military canal in Kent on the edge of Rumney Marsh, and at the same time, Boney is cheerfully mocked with caricatures chalked on the outside of stage coaches, and more caricatures, of course, in print. The Gallic Idol by John Boyne. And then, of course, Gilray, Manic Ravings we have here. George III with an insultingly small Bonaparte. And John Bull with another. John Bull just wants to be allowed to eat his bread and cheese. And here is John Bull again, in a cartoon by an anonymous artist looking phlegmatically at the enemy coast, where regiments of soldiers are lining it in a long grey line. And Hardy gets from his accounts, his historical accounts, that on a sunny day, these soldiers with their hardware could be seen from the English coast. And on a really bright day, what they really looked like was a shoal of silver mackerel. So here's John Bull puffing on his pipe and saying, "May you all be damned." In July 1803, Captain Frank Austen, who has been blockading Boulogne, is now ordered to collect volunteers to protect that long, flat strip of the Kentish coast centering on Pegwell Bay. Now, that's where Julius Caesar is thought to have landed and where migrants are landing today. Frank gathers together retired soldiers and sailors and locals to practice arms and watch the coast on clear days. Now, in London, there is a terror. Boney is going to come and murder everybody and steal all the gold in the Bank of England. Nearer the coast, experts are more nuanced and, in fact, more confident. Captain Austen reports in some detail. He says that in moderate weather, a landing might be effected. On many parts of the Kentish coast, it's not out of the question, but if there's a wind, open flat boats filled with troops would be lost in the surf, while bigger ships could not, from the flatness of the coast, get near enough. And of course, he concludes with confidence, all is subject to the enemy invading our cruisers. Well, the Royal Navy was fairly confident, and here's another print reflecting that view. Bonaparte's army sails in gunboats shaped like coffins. They're wearing shrouds. There's the red cap of liberty being worn by a skull. Very nice. And there's a British ship in the distance, and they're saying, one sailor is saying to another, "I take them their things at the masthead to be Boney's crest, a skull without brains." We can only guess, but probably Frank would have conveyed such confidence to his family. Well, later, after Trafalgar, that puts paid to Napoleon's thoughts about invasion, starts thinking about Spain instead, and then Russia. And later, they would turn that statue in Boulogne right round so that he no longer faces across the channel. Captain Austen continues to rise in the Navy. He becomes commanding officer in the flagship of Nelson's second-in-command. Blockades Boulogne, is recommended for promotion by Nelson himself, given a warship, HMS Canopus, which has been captured at the Battle of the Nile, and sent, he hopes, to take part in the blockade of Cadiz. And it's known there's going to be a great battle, just as things are hotting up for what will be the Battle of Trafalgar. The Canopus must take her turn. It is her turn to go to Gibraltar to get provisions, and to Frank's utter misery, he misses out on Trafalgar and its glory and its prize money. Later he makes up for it in another battle, so we don't need to worry about Frank. Throughout all of this, he receives letters pretty regularly home, mainly from his sister Jane. He never loses his father's letter, and he becomes known as the officer who kneels in church, which not all of them did. He becomes known too for looking after the health of his men, caring about their diet, and he tries things. He's very practical, is Frank. He tries, among other things, coating cheeses with whitewash in order to keep them in good conditions in hot weather. And he's good to his widowed mother. His mother's been widowed in January 1805. And 2 years later, here's Southampton again. We saw it yesterday, the walled city of Southampton, where 2 years later, she and her daughters come to live, sharing the rent of a rather nice new house with Frank and his young wife, Mary, who he met in Ramsgate. Now, Southampton some of Southampton anyway, is really rather nice, with an assembly room for dancing. It's got a theatre. It's horrible today, Southampton. It had circulating libraries and a tree-lined beach walk. Nice. Their house is next to the city wall. They can walk along the wall and look out over Southampton Water and the Isle of Wight. And after the years in Bath, they have a garden, a big garden, and they order a laburnum tree for it in honour of Jane's favourite poet, who we'll meet tomorrow, William Cowper, who writes of laburnum rich in streaming gold. Almost immediately, however, Frank must fit out his new ship, the St. Albans, and take her on a very long voyage. And where does he end up first? Simon's Bay. Depicted here not by Frank, he didn't draw as far as we know, but by an officer some 30-odd years later. Now, he doesn't draw Simon's Town, but he does make nice notes. He's very, very precise. He complains that wood is very expensive to buy here. He says the water is plentiful. That's nice. And of an excellent quality, says Frank. A stream is brought by pipes to the extremity of the wharf, where 2 boats may fill with hoses at the same time, but as the water which supplies it is frequently diverted to other purposes by the inhabitants, it is rather a tedious mode of supplying the wants of a squadron. The inhabitants are a mixture of many nations, principally descended from the first Dutch settlers, whose language is in general use. The government is now English, but regulated by colonial laws as established by the Dutch East India Company, somewhat ameliorated now by the milder influence of British law. So there. While her husband is away at sea, he goes to China next, Mrs. Frank Austen would give birth to 11 children, dying of the last, like Elizabeth, wife of brother Edward, all of which might have helped to put their dear sisters-in-law off marriage. Over his illustrious career, Frank will travel all over the world. One of Jane's few surviving letters is to him when he's in the Baltic, which stirs her imagination. It must be a real enjoyment to you, since you are obliged to leave England, to see something of a new country, and one that has been so distinguished as Sweden. I have great respect for former Sweden, so zealous as it was for Protestantism. Gustavus Vasa, Charles XII, Queen Christina, and the great Linnaeus. Do their ghosts rise up before you? Well, Frank is very down to earth. He writes back a long letter. We don't have it, but we do have Jane's delighted answer, expressed in terms of money. He's already written her a wonderful letter. You pay most liberally, My letter was a scratch compared to yours. And then you write so even, so clear, both in style and penmanship, so much to the point, and give such real intelligence that it is enough to kill one. I am sorry Sweden is so poor, which he must have told her, and he's obviously been in North Germany too, because she goes on, the idea of a fashionable bathing place in Mecklenburg. How can people pretend to be fashionable or to bathe out of England? Your account of Rostock Market makes one's mouth water. Our cheapest butcher's meat is double the price of theirs. So he gives lots of information. Now, as well as going on reading novels, the mature Jane, which she now is, also devours history, politics, and foreign travel. The Abolition of the African Slave Trade by Thomas Clarkson, whom she greatly admires, and an essay by a Captain Pasley, who writes on the military policy and institutions of the British Empire. I am almost in love with Captain Pasley. He writes with such force and spirit. Nothing but our naval superiority has saved us from being, at this moment, a province of France. And the Captain Pasley confirms her very happy feeling that it's on men like her dear brothers that the safety of England depends. Frank is the family star. Jane is nowhere. Frank ends up as a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath and one or two other things besides. By then, Jane was long dead. Now, years before, in her History of England, written aged 15, she had hopefully compared young brother Frank to Sir Francis Drake, the ornament of his country and his profession, yet great as he was, and justly celebrated as sailor, I cannot help foreseeing that he will be equalled in this or the next century by one who, though now but young, already promises to answer all the expectations of his relations and friends, among whom I may class the amiable lady to whom this work is dedicated, that's Cassandra, and my no less amiable self. Frank would end up in the top job, Admiral of the Fleet. His young sister hadn't been that far out. In fact, she hadn't been out at all. Fanny Price and her midshipman brother, devoted brother and sister in Mansfield Park. Here on the left, is it the left? Yes, it is. It's your left, yes. We see them happily reunited at the start of William's shore leave. He's rather sweetly holding his sister's fan. And on the right, they're horrified because Mrs. Norris, who's awful, is threatening to come with them in the coach on their trip to Portsmouth and ruining their fun. William Price is a mixture of Jane's two brothers, Frank and Charles. Charles is 4 years younger than Jane and seems to have been a darling. He was the handsomest of the family, jolly good looking as he is, and seems to have been a sweet character, generous, kindly and brave. Whenever his name enters Jane's letters, she writes of him very tenderly, as opposed to the fiery and insolent Frank. Charles is also a good dancer, as is William Price. This is assembly night, says William. If I were at Portsmouth, I should be at it perhaps. But, says Fanny, you do not wish yourself at Portsmouth, William? No, Fanny, I do not. I shall have enough of Portsmouth and of dancing when I cannot have you. And I do not know that there would be any good going to the assembly, for I might not get a partner. The Portsmouth girls turn their noses up at anybody who has not got a commission. One might as well be nothing as a midshipman. Oh, shame, says Fanny, but never mind it, William. It is no reflection on you. It is no more than what the greatest admirals have experienced in their time. You must make up your mind to it as one of the hardships that fall to every sailor's share, like bad weather and hard living. I should like to go to a ball with you, Fanny, says William, and see you dance. We used to jump about together many a time, did we not? when the hand organ was in the street. And here's Charles again. Like Frank, Charles served all his life in the Navy, patrolling the Channel and the North Sea, and in the Mediterranean once, capturing a French warship almost single-handed, it is said, and holding her for 2 days with 4 men till reinforcements arrive. For this, he is awarded £40 prize money, and what does this sweet boy do with it? He spends it on his sisters. He buys 2 topaz crosses and with gold chains, 1 each for Cassandra and Jane, who pretends to be very cross, as you see, but isn't at all cross, and will immortalize him in Mansfield Park by getting William to do the same for Fanny. Now, in 1804, that's the year in which Jane is portrayed looking out to sea, and in which Brother Frank is blockading Boulogne. Charles must go and patrol the eastern seaboard of the United States of America, seizing deserters from the British Navy. There are a lot of those, the Americans pay better, and blocking American trade with France. He meets his wife in Bermuda, 16-year-old Fanny Palmer, stayed there for a couple of years, and then, at last, returns with wife and 2 little girls to Portsmouth Harbour, depicted in a bit of a storm by Turner here. Now, the downfall of Napoleon is bad news for the Navy and for the Austens in many ways. Unemployment looms. And the following year, poor Charles suffers a greater misfortune, shipwreck off the coast of Turkey. While back home, his wife Fanny has died in childbirth of her 3rd child, not her 11th. His miserable journey back on board ship, somebody else's ship, accompanied by dreams of his dead wife, is cheered to some extent by reading his sister's new novel, Emma, which she very thoughtfully sends him. Charles is then badly out of work, but he is resourceful. He takes a job as a coast guard, a bit humiliating, but it pays. He takes his young family to live across the harbour from Portsmouth, from where they can all have a look at the Grand Fleet out at Spithead. One morning, scanning the horizon, Charles sees a frigate about to set sail. As he watches, he sees the anchor is being dropped. The ship is coming to a halt. The captain's flag is being hauled down to half-mast. Sign of a captain's death. Charles takes a post-chaise to the Admiralty in London, reports for the death, asks for the vacant post, gets it, sails 4 days later to Jamaica. And from then, he's never out of a job, though he would never be as rich as Frank. Years later, long after his sister's death, Rear Admiral Charles Austen, aged 71, would lead the British forces in the Second Burmese War and capture Rangoon. And from all accounts, he preserves his sweet nature, though probably not to the Burmese. A nephew is with him throughout the campaign, and he writes in letters home of the dear old Admiral, without exception, the kindest and most perfectly gentlemanlike man I ever knew. And 2 years later, the old Admiral dies of cholera on board ship, and there was said to be not a dry eye among the whole crew, who clearly shared his young sister's view. Now, it's very hard for us to imagine what Portsmouth Harbour might have been like 200 years ago today. Much of it is very state-of-the-art, but some buildings date from Jane's day. This white one does. That's from 1708, the Porter's Lodge. And then there is the main gate, or Victory Gate, from 3 years later, and some others, including the Royal Naval Academy, where both the boys went to school. First built under King Henry VII, later, from the second half of the 18th century, the whole place had been greatly enlarged, the dockyards, on reclaimed land to cover some 50 square miles. There are artists to help us get the atmosphere of Jane's day. Joan Hassel, who produces lovely woodcuts in the 1950s, such as this of Fanny and friends walking by the harbour. And then, thank heaven, there is also Thomas Rowlandson. Portsmouth Point, or Spice Island, a seedy area on the eastern end of the harbour opposite Gosport. On the right, the Ship's Tavern. On the left, Moses Levy's money-changing shop. Yes, there's the Ship's Tavern. Quite an area, very, very sleazy, known for prostitutes and press gangs, and the probable haunt of Fanny Price's coarse father, Lieutenant Price of the Marines. Fanny having been adopted and more or less brought up from childhood in a more genteel atmosphere of Mansfield Park. So when she is sent on a visit home to Portsmouth, she is shocked by her father, who read only the newspaper and the Navy list, talked only of the dockyard, the harbour, Spithead and the Mother Bank. He swore, he drank, he was dirty and gross. In he walked, his own loud voice preceding him, as with something of the oath kind, he kicked away his son's portmanteau and his daughter's bandbox in the passage and called for a candle. No candle was brought. And Lieutenant Price's house is the abode of noise, disorder, and impropriety. Nobody was in their right place, nothing was done as it should be, whatever was wanted was hallooed for, and the servants hallooed their excuses back from the kitchen. The doors were constant banging, the stairs were never at rest, nothing was done without a clatter, and nobody could command attention when they spoke. And the ghastly Mr. Price sounds to me a very near relation of Gilray's famous Jack Tar. Now, Jane attached great importance to the opinions of her family about her novels. She writes them all down, not least the opinions of both sailor brothers, neither of whom say much about Mansfield Park. And one biographer suggests that the brothers, both of them dedicated to the Navy, might have been a bit narked by this public representation of naval low life. Well, we don't know if that is so, but if it is, Jane would more than make up for it in her next novel but one, Persuasion, the last she would complete. A historical painting from 30 years after the Battle of Trafalgar. The wounded Victory sails in ribbons, being towed to Gibraltar on the right for repairs. For years to come in England, people would remember where they were and what they were doing when they heard the traumatic news of the great victory at Trafalgar and at the same time the death of the idolized commander. Too much to take in. Here's Nelson's ornate funeral car, designed to look a bit like the Victory, and on this funeral car, his coffin was carried to St. Paul's in London. Everybody was in bits, not least Frank Austen, having had hopes from Nelson of promotion. Now, I think they had dinner once or twice. Frank did meet Nelson, although there's not much said about it, but he also met the defeated French admiral, defeated at Trafalgar, Admiral Villeneuve. And Frank gets this man absolutely wrong. He writes that Admiral Villeneuve is a very tranquil, placid, English-looking Frenchman with an unmeaning countenance and not much the appearance of a gentleman. He is, however, so much a Frenchman as to bear his misfortune with cheerfulness, writes Frank. Not many months later, the deeply shamed Admiral Villeneuve would stab himself to death in a hotel room in Rennes. Trafalgar had put an end to the ambitions of the French Navy and had raised the reputations of our naval officers sky high. They can do no wrong. Lovely for the Austens, of course, but very irritating to landsmen like the fictional Sir Walter Elliot in Jane's last completed novel. Here on the far right is the vain and snobbish Sir Walter Elliot, seen here promenading in Bath with his well-preserved military friend Colonel Wallis on his left, who is very well preserved but not quite as good looking as him, he says, because very unfortunately poor Colonel Wallis has sandy hair. And here's Sir Walter on the subject of the Navy. It is in 2 points offensive to me, he says. First, as being the means of bringing persons of obscure birth into undue distinction, and raising men to honours which their fathers and grandfathers never dreamed of, and secondly, as it cuts up a man's youth and vigour most horribly. A sailor grows old sooner than any other man. I have observed it all my life. A man is in greater danger in the Navy of being insulted by the rise of one whose father, his father, might have disdained to speak to, and of being prematurely an object of disgust himself, than in any other line. One day last spring in town, I was in company with a certain Admiral Baldwin, the most deplorable-looking person you can imagine. His face the colour of mahogany, rough and rugged to the last degree, all lines and wrinkles, 9 grey hairs of a side and nothing but a dab of powder on top. In the name of heaven, said I, who is that old fellow? Old fellow, cried my friend who was standing by. It is Admiral Baldwin. What do you take his age to be? 60, said I, or perhaps 62. 40, replied my friend. 40 and no more. It is the same with them all, continues Sir Walter Elliot. They're all knocked about and exposed to every climate and every weather until they're not fit to be seen. It is a pity they're not all hit on the head at once before they reach Admiral Baldwin's age. Well, from the start of the novel, Sir Walter's opinions are thoroughly discredited, including, of course, that one. The action of Persuasion takes place after the final peace with France, 1815, some years earlier, 2 years after Trafalgar. Marine artist Nicholas Pocock depicted Nelson's flagships at anchor, drying their sails in a calm at Spithead, symbolic of peace. I'm going to leave this up for a moment. In Persuasion, the Navy can do no wrong. We meet the disabled Captain Harville, lamed in war, living on half pay with his wife, with no sign of dissatisfaction, coping